Okay, the content for Chapter 10 is Adaptations to Resistance Training, and specifically we're talking about neuromuscular adaptations and chronic adaptations at that. What are long-term adaptations that the muscle and the neurons will experience due to planned bouts of resistance training? Slide number 2 is the overview. The chapter begins with a discussion of resistance training and potential effects, and then it talks about the mechanism by which the muscle will gain strength, both neurologically and muscularly. And then the last part of the chapter talks a little bit about diet and how diet impacts resistance training and muscle strength gains. Um, Slide 3, the gains in strength are not only due to strength gains in muscle, but it's a neuromuscular system. The neurons and the muscles are working together. So many of the increases in gain in regards to strength are a result of neurological changes as well. And typically, the neurological changes may occur prior to changes in hypertrophy and muscle changes. On slide 4, after 3 to 6 months of resistance training, there can be as much as 25 to 100% strength gain. It's important to make sure that as one is doing resistance training, they're focusing on safety and technique and making sure that their movements become more efficient. And if that's the case, then there could be a change in the actual morphology of the muscle and the size and the diameter of the muscle, because the muscles are malleable. They're relatively plastic. Young men and women are going to experience more gains than adults, and some of those gains are going to be due to both neurological changes and also muscular changes. When the muscle gets bigger and grows, it's known as hypertrophy, and when the muscle mass starts to deteriorate or decreases, that's known as atrophy. And it appears as though, from a very basic level, muscle strength is positively associated with muscle size, such that increased muscle size yields increased muscle strength, and vice versa. A decrease in muscle size, either due to no training or detraining, is going to result in decreased muscle strength. But that's not the whole story. It's a neuromuscular system. So strength gains are going to result from an increase in muscle size or manipulation of the muscle, but it could also and does also occur because of a manipulation or changes at the neural level. Figure 10.1 on slide 6 shows that both for males and females during a typical snatch exercise, individuals who weigh less don't lift as much, or individuals who presumably don't have as much fat-free mass can't lift as much. And then on slide 7, 8, and 7 and 8, it shows two different exercises, a clean and jerk, and then total weight. And it also mirrors the same results. So regardless of which exercise they're talking about, it seems as though increased muscle mass yields increased ability to lift total weight. But like we said, there are neurological issues that also can positively impact strength gain. On slide 9, it starts to discuss these. Things like motor unit recruitment, stimulation frequency, potentially rate coding, recruitment of the appropriate type 1, type 2 muscle fiber types. These things can all possibly increase muscle strength without necessarily hypertrophy. So in the beginning of the strength and conditioning programs that you give to your clients, they're going to actually start to get stronger. But when they look at themselves in the mirror, they're not necessarily getting bigger. Usually what happens is the body is going to try to make itself stronger using the resources that it already has. It's costly for the body to make protein and muscle, so the body's going to try to make whatever muscle it has and whatever neurological firing that it has more efficient, so that it can gain strength without having to necessarily build anything. But then once you keep the intensity keep going and the strength and conditioning program progresses, and the body still needs to improve strength or get more powerful. Well, if the neurological system is running as effectively as it can, then the body is sort of forced to increase strength by now starting to lay down protein and increase protein synthesis. So for the most part, you'll notice that in the beginning, for the first 8 to 10 weeks, a lot of the changes occur without muscle hypertrophy. Um, and remember, it's a neuromuscular system, so the neurons and the muscles are working together, and what's going to emerge is the change in physiology or the morphology of the muscle. Slide 10, it could be the case that motor unit recruitment happens sporadically at first, and then as you train, the action potentials and the recruitment of the motor units start to become more synchronized, and it could be that more synchronous activation of those motor units is resulting in strength gains. I don't have the reference right now, but there was an article that I used to present in class. It was about pitchers that had individuals who had pain while pitching and individuals who did not have pain while pitching. And they just did a quick EMG study about the rotator cuff muscle, and it showed that the individuals who had pain had a different firing of their rotator cuff muscles than the individuals who did not have pain. There are 4 rotator cuff muscles, and there's a particular synchronization that those muscles should potentially fire in. And if the synchronization is off, potentially it could lead to a reduction in strength and power, or not as much stabilization. So the timing, muscle activation timing, which is something that EMG can help us understand, the activation or the timing of one muscle compared to the other. So it could be the case that with strength training, resistance training, the motor unit activation synchronization becomes more effective, and that could be one of the precursor mechanisms for increase in strength. It could also, on slide 11, strength gains can also potentially be because of greater motor unit recruitment. There's increased neural drive during maximal contraction, increased frequency of neural discharge, and a reduction in inhibitory impulses from the Golgi tendon organs and potentially muscle spindles. So because of that, there could be a greater or a more effective recruitment of larger motor units that could potentially result in strength gain. There's limited evidence that suggests rate coding increases with resistance training, but if that's the case, then more research is needed in order to clarify that. Lastly, on slide 13, autogenic inhibition, the Golgi tendon organs. If I'm doing an exercise and the exercise is elongating, there's a huge force on the limb, and the limb is elongating the tendon, and that force is elongating the tendon. It could be the case that the tendon feels as though it's potential for injury. So there's a signal from the Golgi tendon organ to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord makes the muscle relax. And if that's the case, then a relaxed muscle can't produce force. So it could be the case that the neural signaling from the muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs can become more effective. And if it becomes more effective, the muscles will be inhibited less. The automatic inhibition or relaxation of the muscles when the tension on the tendon is too much will be reduced, and that could also lead to increases in strength. There are other neural factors such as coactivation of agonist and antagonist muscles, and potentially if there's reduced coactivation, there could be potential for increase in strength gain. So those are some typical mechanisms by which the neurological system can increase muscle strength without necessarily hypertrophy. But then as the strength and conditioning program progresses and the intensity of the exercises continues and you're still adding weight, eventually the neurological changes are not going to be enough. Eventually the body is going to be forced to lay down protein to start to increase muscle so that it can keep up with the increased stresses and increased demands as people are following the overloading principle. So hypertrophy is going to eventually occur. This is on slide 15. Hypertrophy is increase in muscle size. There's potential different mechanisms by which hypertrophy occurs. We'll talk about it in the next couple of slides. There's transient hypertrophy, which you'll feel immediately after or during a bout of exercise. As you lift, there's swelling, there's increased plasma fluid, and you'll feel that your muscles become like almost acutely bigger. But this is transient hypertrophy, and after a while, it will subside. Chronic hypertrophy or long-term hypertrophy reflects actual changes in the amount of actin and myosin, the length of the sarcomeres, and the amount of sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so chronic hypertrophy is what we're going to focus on in regards to muscular adaptations to resistance training. Figure 10.2 shows that albeit there are muscles, there's the same number of muscle cells. What happens is the muscle cells start to grow in diameter and circumference. There's an increase in actin, myosin, protein filaments within each of the muscle fibers, and it appears as though, like the rings of a tree, make the trunk bigger and bigger each year. Seems as though that's the predominant mechanism by which muscle fibers are going to increase size. Slide 17, chronic muscle hypertrophy is going to be maximized by focusing on not only concentric muscle contractions, but also making sure that the athlete is performing eccentric muscle contractions. It appears as though eccentric, or the lengthening of the muscle as it contracts, does a little bit of micro damage, and what it does is it disrupts the sarcomere Z lines, and what that does is going to promote synthesis of actin and myosin and protein. So it could be the case that just focusing on concentric training alone might limit hypertrophy. So make sure that you're doing all of your concentric muscle contractions and also focusing on good, slow, eccentric negatives to make sure that you get the full effect of the hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is going to result in increase in myofibrils, more actin and myosin filament, more sarcoplasm, more connective tissue, and there's less evidence that suggests that a muscle fiber actually splits in two, and hypertrophy is less likely occurring because of what's called hyperplasia, or the increase in the number of muscle fibers as opposed to the increase in the diameter and circumference of the muscle fibers. From the research that I've seen or that I've read, it seems as though the number of muscle fibers and the percentage of muscle fibers that you have when you're born is very similar to the number and percentage of muscle fibers that you have throughout your life. We are on slide 19. Resistance training is going to lead to an increase in protein synthesis. Endurance training is going to lead to an increase in all of the cardiovascular characteristics of the muscle, increase in capillarization, increase in hemoglobin, increase in mitochondrial density and size. But resistance training, especially if the training is intense enough, is going to lead to protein synthesis. Now, when the intensity is high enough, the muscle thinks it could potentially become injured, so there's going to be some type of response. The muscle is going to trigger hormone release, which is going to release testosterone. The testosterone, that anabolic steroid, is going to go directly through the muscle, the membrane of the muscle, right to the nucleus, because it's a steroid hormone. The steroid hormone is going to get directly into the nucleus, and it's going to change the RNA in the nucleus, and that's going to result in some mutations. And the mutation is an increase in actin, myosin, and increase in muscle mass. In regards to hyperplasia, which is the separation of one muscle fiber into two muscle fibers, most of the research has been done on animals, cats, chickens, mice, and rats. And it appears as though with intense strength training, there could be fiber splitting and hyperplasia, but we're not going to focus on that because it doesn't seem as though for humans it's the predominant or even a huge contributor in terms of muscle hypertrophy. We're on slide 22. For humans, most hypertrophy is due to fiber hypertrophy. Fiber hyperplasia may contribute, but still more research is needed. So we're going to keep it with just talking about hypertrophy. All right, we're on slide 24, figure 10.4. In 25, there's an animation, so I'll assume that you guys can pay attention to the animation. We're on slide 26, neural activation and hypertrophy. Um, the short-term increases in muscle strength are most likely going to be because there's neural adaptation occurring. So for the first 8 to 10 weeks of a strength and conditioning program, you may not see an appreciable amount of hypertrophy or increase in muscle size, although the number of sets and reps and the intensity during the sets and reps might increase. That's more likely due to the fact that there's changes in the neurology before there's changes to the muscle size. And laying down protein and making muscle mass, that costs the body energy. So before the body gets and commits to a high energy demand or a high caloric demand in regards to building protein, it's going to try to use whatever muscle it has to do the same job. And the first strategy that the body has is to see if the brain can send signals to the muscles more effectively at the right timing. See if the body can utilize the muscle that it has to do the strength before it starts to commit to put down more muscle mass. Long-term increases in muscle strength are most associated with hypertrophy and increases in the actual the number of protein filaments. Um, we're on slide 27. If you don't exercise, or if you have been exercising and you reduce the amount of exercise, there's going to be a reduction in the amount of hypertrophy. So there's like a use it or lose it mentality. Many different detraining studies or limb immobilization studies have shown that even after as little as 6 hours of immobilization, there's potential muscle atrophy. So if you're not using the muscle, then you're losing the muscle. During the first week of immobilization, there's a potential reduction in size atrophy, but there's also a reduction in neuromuscular activity and effectiveness. That these things are potentially reversible with more bouts of training. This detraining could potentially lead to reductions in 1 RM max, which is your one repetition max. And so if you look at slide 30, it shows a couple of different examples, slide 30, 31, and 32, different examples of individuals who start with a pre-training, and you'll notice that there's a mean 1 RM value. Pre-20 means that's before they did 20 weeks of training, and then you'll notice that after the 20 weeks of training, that mean 1 RM value has increased, so that represents increase in muscle strength. But then they followed that post-20 with 6 weeks of detraining, and you'll see that there's a reduction in the 1 RM value. And then after 6 weeks of training again, you'll see that there's a resultant increase in their 1 RM value. So with training, one repetition max values increase. With detraining, there's a reduction in the 1 RM max values. And then with post-training, there's also a resultant increase. And you'll notice the same is for the mean 1 RM values for the next subject. And then on slide 32, you'll notice that there's a slight difference between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers in regards to the atrophy given weeks of no training. So you'll notice that the blue lines, there's in the pre-20, there's an increase in the mean cross-sectional area of muscle size, and then which is an indicator of hypertrophy. And then after that 20 weeks of training, there's an increase in that mean cross-sectional area of the blue graph. But then with the pre-6, after the 6 weeks of detraining, it doesn't seem as though there's a significant amount of atrophy. And then there's another smaller jump from 4,800 to 5,000 micrometers squared, or regardless, their cross-sectional area seems to relatively stay stable with detraining with type 1 muscle fiber types. But type 2 muscle fiber type A and type 2 muscle fiber type 2X seem to atrophy at a greater rate than the type 1 muscle fiber types. It doesn't appear as though there's huge evidence that suggests that type 1 muscle fiber types can become type 2 muscle fiber types and such, but it seems as though that type 2X muscle fiber types can transition to type 2A muscle fiber types, giving heavy resistance training. It could be the case that with type 1 muscle fiber types, the contractile properties increase, and with type 2 muscle fiber types, their ability to utilize oxygen increases. But there's not as much evidence that suggests that type 1 and type 2 muscle fiber transitions occur. Slide 36 discusses the impact of diet on resistance training. And obviously, if you're going to try to make muscle, then you're going to have resources that are going to complement the increase in protein demand. So it could be the case that individuals who are specifically focusing on hypertrophy could have to increase the amount of protein in the diet. But the research that I found suggests that the United States diet has plenty of protein. So because of that, it doesn't appear as though, unless you're trying to do big, huge hypertrophy gains, that it doesn't appear. My suggestion for my athletes is that they don't need to do protein supplementation as long as they're eating enough protein at the right time. So enough protein at the right time. And suggestion is right after a resistance training exercise, you want to consume 20 to 25 grams of protein. Just for a reference, a chicken breast, a small chicken breast without bone, is about 30 grams of protein. An individual who's trying to increase muscle mass should be at about 1.6 to 1.7 grams of protein per gram body weight, and that comes to, for me, about 120, 130 grams of protein per day, and that's if I'm really trying to pump out as much muscle building as I can. And again, that's only going to be about 3 chicken breasts. There's about 20 grams of protein in a can of tuna. So about 3.5 cans of tuna is the amount of protein that we need, even if you're trying to increase muscle masses at a pretty high rate. So it seems as though that most people are able to accomplish that amount of protein in the United States diet. So for my athletes who are younger and who also have like financial cost potential demands, because they're kids and parents have lots of kids, and sometimes to suggest get whey protein, and it becomes costly to them. So the suggestion is 20 grams of protein every 2 to 3 hours after you exercise. Figure 10.7 on slide 37 has an animation. 10.7 on slide 38, I'll let you do that. And then there's also a video on slide 39. In regards to resistance training for special populations, young children should exercise as long as it's safe. It seems as though that the athletes that I have are between 12 and 18 years old, and as long as it seems as though they're like reaching puberty, I'll let them do the strength conditioning program that we have. We're utilizing kettlebells and barbells and dumbbells, and for the most part, what we try to do is make sure that they have an extensive 5-week training program. We go through all of the techniques of all of the lifts that we want them to do. We make sure that I am fastidious about the technique that they're using, about the workout maturity, about the rest that they have, and we try to make sure that we have safety precautions as much as possible. The gym that we use, I try to make sure it is laid out very clean, very careful. All the weights are racked. If we can use weight vests and ankle weights as opposed to dumbbells and kettlebells, we try to do that. We try to do a lot of bungee work to minimize heavy weights being around the kids. But it seems as though as long as their workout maturity is good and I'm able to supervise and make sure that the technique is effectively, it seems as though the children are able to do it. Now, I want to make sure that the athletes that I'm doing strength and conditioning with are going through puberty. I make sure that they have that little tiny mustache over here. Make sure that their muscle mass looks that it's starting to grow, because I feel as though the strength and conditioning program is all about body chemistry. We're trying to get testosterone to release, and I don't work with the ladies as much, but we're trying to get growth factor and things like that, growth hormone to release. And if they're prepubescent and they don't have the testosterone release, then the biochemistry can't occur. So for those younger athletes, I'd much rather do stabilization, body shaping exercises and stuff like that. So For our guys, for the children, and for it's mostly 12 to 18 years old. It seems as though as long as I'm organized and they understand the technique and what they're doing, it seems to be safe. Anytime they have injury or things like that, we either alter the exercise or we don't do the exercise and allow them to rest and foam roll and things like that. But it seems as though the resistance training for younger kids is a good thing. If they obviously want to take a look at the in exercise chapter 9, we talked about individuals who are beginners versus experienced trainers should focus on the frequency, the duration, to make sure that your exercise prescription is appropriate. But for young adults, it seems as though resistance training is safe, and as long as we're focusing on technique and not introducing biomechanical disadvantages, the athletes will benefit. In regards to elderly, increased muscle mass is going to result in a reduction in potential risk for falls because of increased stability, and also increased resistance training is going to put forces on bones that's going to help potentially positively impact bone density and things like that. So a healthy lifetime of resistance training for both young and old populations is reasonable. And then we're on slide 42, the last slide, resistance training for sport. There are many sports that are going to potentially benefit from resistance training, but we just have to make sure that we do a good needs analysis to figure out whether or not the sport needs strength, whether or not it needs power, whether or not it's predominantly an endurance exercise. Therefore, will strength training and resistance training result in a reduction in speed and power for those athletes? We have to make sure that we have an analysis of time and cost and availability of equipment and things like that. But it seems as though that most sports will benefit from some type of organized strength and conditioning regimen that follows the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines. Chapter 10 is relatively short. I hope you would enjoy, and I hope you have a nice day. Take care.